guys, welcome to Anatomy and Physiology 1. Today we're going to go through Chapter 1 on the Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. So first, what is anatomy and what is physiology? Technically, anatomy and physiology are two different sciences. We study them together because they are so closely related to each other, but they are technically two different things. Anatomy is a science that studies or describes the structures of the body. So this thing could include many different descriptors of the structures, what they're made of. So what type of material makes up the heart? It's cardiac muscle. What type of material, makes up the deltoid muscle? That's skeletal muscle. Where different structures are located. So saying that the deltoid muscle is in the upper arm, or the radius is in the thumb side of the forearm. That's describing the anatomy of the body. Also, associated structures, or how structures come together. That's also anatomy. Also, one thing that's kind of major that I don't have here is naming structures, right? So the bone here in the upper arm is the humerus. That's anatomy. It's the name of it and the location. So anatomy is all very structural. Physiology, on the other hand, is the study of the functions of the body. So not the shape and structure, but the function, what it does. Now this could be an individual function, like the function of that one single organ, or cooperative functions, like the function of the whole cardiovascular system, right? But in general, you could say that anatomy is structure, physiology is function. So again, examples of anatomy, I just went through a bunch of them, but you could say the bone in the upper arm is the humerus, right? We named it, that's anatomy, and we said its location, also anatomy. Physiology or function, I could say that the heart pumps blood through the body. Right? I'm telling you what it does. That's what the heart does. It pumps blood through the body. So that's the physiology of the heart, or the function of the heart. You guys should know the definition of each of these, and then you should also know the examples. So if I give you a statement, you should be able to tell me whether or not that's an example of anatomy or physiology. Now, again, these are two different sciences, but we very frequently study them together, obviously, right? The course you're taking right now is called Anatomy and Physiology. And the reason that we study these together is that they are really closely associated with each other, right? The anatomy or the shape, composition, and position of each body part is specifically designed for its function. Okay, so the simpler way to say this would be a body part's structure determines its function. Okay, so structure determines function. We see this all over the place. This isn't just the human body, right? Or not even just living things. We see this all over. Engineers apply this principle constantly. Think about your car. Hey, the tires on your car, what shape are they? Right? They're round, right? Why are they round? Because they roll, right? They're shaped that way because their function is to roll. Imagine if your tires were square, right? That'd be a really bumpy ride. That would be terrible. That the structure would not go along with the intended function. So structure determines function. Now let's say that using the actual technical terms, right? Let's say that using anatomy and physiology. We could say a body part's anatomy determines its physiology. Now over here in this picture, we see all sorts of anatomy. And then we could also see how that anatomy relates to physiology. So what we're looking at here is obviously the arm, right? The bone in the upper arm, this bone right here is the humerus. And then in the forearm, we have the radius and the ulna. That's all anatomy because we're naming the bones and talking about where they are. We could also talk about some more anatomy when we talk about the shape of the bones. So the distal or the distant end of the humerus has a round process, right? The proximal or like top end of the ulna has a U-shaped depression. That's all anatomy. Shape, right? Structure. We could also talk about how they come together. This rounded process of the humerus fits just inside that U-shaped depression. And that's what you see right here. Right, so that's anatomy. It's telling you how structures come together. So the humerus sits inside this depression of the ulna, and that forms the elbow joint. Now, all of that structure or all of that anatomy is really important when you look at the function of the elbow. Right, the elbow is a joint that allows smooth movement along this one single plane. Right? It can't like spin all around. It can't go sideways the other way. It goes in this one single plane. That's the function of the elbow joint, to allow movement along this one single plane, like a hinge. The only reason that that joint is able to function that way is because of its structure. It's structured just perfectly for that. Imagine if instead of this rounded process, the end of the humerus looked like that. Right? Would that joint still run nice and smooth? No, it wouldn't work at all, right? It would be, if this was pointed like that, it would be super wobbly. It would just go all over the place. There would be no control. So the anatomy wouldn't fit with the physiology in that case. So anatomy is very important in that it determines the physiology or the function of the organ or the organ system. And we'll look at this a lot as we go through each chapter. We'll start by kind of looking at the anatomy of the whatever it is we're looking at, whatever the body part is. We'll look at its anatomy, its structure, what it's made of. And then we'll start to relate that to what it actually does or its physiology. Now we'll talk briefly about the levels of organization. There are 6 levels of organization. And they start really simple, right? Like chemicals, molecules, these microscopic little things. And then they get more and more and more complex until eventually we get to the whole organism like the human. And we use these levels of organization to try and understand the way that really complex things work, like humans, right? If you just look at me right now and I say, how do I work? There's no way that you can look at me and tell me, right? You can't just look at my body and tell me how my cardiovascular system works or how my respiratory system works. The body is much too complex to understand just by looking at it. Right? We have to break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller components until we can start with just the simplest little thing. And this is not a new concept either. If you think about a book, right? If I grabbed a novel and I asked you to tell me all about it, you can't look at the cover and tell me all about it, right? You have to read the book. And when you read a book, you start with the first letter on the first page. A single letter is really simple. But if you understand one letter, then you can put together multiple letters and you can get a word. Then you put together multiple words and you get a sentence. Multiple sentences give you a paragraph, right? And then you get a chapter. And then eventually, once you've read all the chapters, you've read the whole book, then you understand what it's about. This is the same thing that we do to understand the body. We work through the 6 levels of organization and we start really simple, like with one individual letter. We start really, really small and then we build our way up bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually we can understand the way that the body works, hopefully. So the simplest level, right, like the one little letter, is the chemical or molecular level. Right? The chemical level or molecular level includes molecules, right? Chemicals, atoms. An atom is the smallest chemical unit, right? The smallest individual unit. Like you could say one atom of oxygen, one atom of carbon, one atom of sodium, right? One single unit. Now we put multiple atoms together. We start to join them together and make bigger things. And those are called molecules, right? So for example, if I put 2 atoms of hydrogen together with 1 oxygen, I get H2O. H2O is a molecule, right? There's 3 atoms there, and that's just water, right? That's 1 molecule of water. So we took these individual little atoms like hydrogen, and oxygen, and we put them together to make something bigger, right? It's like taking a couple little letters and putting them together to make a small word. So these atoms and molecules are all in this chemical level. Now, eventually, if we put enough chemicals together, we can get something big enough to be a cell. And cells are included in the cellular level. So we have groups of atoms and molecules and tiny little structures called organelles and proteins and fats, all working together to form one single cell in the cellular level. Now, once we put together multiple cells, we get the next complex level, which is the tissue level. The tissue level, again, includes a group of similar cells working together. So, for example, this could be a group of cardiac muscle cells forms cardiac muscle tissue. A group of neurons forms nervous tissue. Right? A group of bone cells forms bone tissue. Okay? So you see that these are kind of building, right? The chemical level includes chemicals. You put a bunch of them together and you get cells in the cellular level. Then you put a bunch of cells together and you get tissues in the tissue level. Now, if we put a bunch of tissues together, okay, 2 or more tissues together, we'll get to the next level, which is the organ level. And that's on this next slide. So we had tissue, right? And we put 2 or more different types of tissues together, and that gives us an organ, right? And organs are in the organ level. So examples of organs include the heart, right? Bone, the stomach, the pancreas, the liver, the brain, right? There's lots of different organs. The skin is an organ. Now, if we put multiple organs together, we get the next complex level, which is the organ system. So an organ system, again, is just a group of organs working together. And humans have 11 different organ systems. These include things like the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, the nervous system, the urinary system, the integumentary system. Then if we put all 11 of these organ systems together, that gives us the most complex level, which is the organism, right? And in this case, the human is what we're talking about because this is human anatomy and physiology. You guys should be able to put these in order from the simplest to the most complex. And you should know what's included in each level. It's kind of easy because they just build on each other, right? So like multiple organs comes together to form the organ level. Multiple organs comes together to form the organ system. The organ systems come together to form the organism. So as long as you can put them in order, you know what's in each category. These next 2 slides just kind of show an example of this. Here we have the very first level, which is chemical and molecular. You'll notice we've got atoms joining together to form molecules, right? Once we get enough together, we have something kind of complex like protein molecules. Here we've got a lot of proteins together to form these filaments of, this specifically is actin and myosin. Those are proteins that are in muscle. And eventually we get enough of these together and we get the whole cell. This is a heart muscle cell or cardiac muscle cell. Now, if we put a bunch of these heart muscle cells together, we're going to get tissue. And that's what you see here, right? Cardiac muscle tissue. We put multiple tissues together and we get an organ, in this case, the heart. We put multiple organs together and we get an organ system, right? In this case, it's the cardiovascular system with the heart and the blood vessels and the blood. And then eventually we put all of the organ systems together and we get the human, right? The organism. We're going to take a second and talk about this concept of homeostasis. And homeostasis is a really important concept because essentially it's what our body is doing all the time. This is the way that our body stays alive, is by maintaining homeostasis. And if the body's not able to maintain homeostasis, well, that's when disease occurs. That's when the body gets sick or unhealthy. So we'll talk a bit about homeostasis and what this really means. The definition of homeostasis is all body systems working together to maintain a stable internal environment. To put that simply, that just means keeping everything normal. Right? We don't want these crazy fluctuations in our body. We want to maintain stability. We want to be in a normal range. In order to maintain homeostasis, the body has to constantly be responding to both external and internal changes. Things are always changing around us, right? And inside our body. And our body needs to react to make sure that we don't go off into these really wide ranges. For example, body temperature. Hey, right now I'm in my house and it's 74 degrees in my house, but my body temperature has not dropped to 74 degrees. My body is able to react, and there are certain processes that occur to keep my body temperature warm at about 98.6 degrees. Now it's really hot outside today. If I go outside, my body's not going to automatically heat up to the temperature outside. It's going to remain at 98.6 degrees. It's going to remain stable or homeostatic. There are numerous examples of how the body maintains homeostasis or stays in this nice stable range. For example, fluid balance, like how much water you have inside you. I'm going to probably drink all this water by the end of the lecture, but my body's not going to just swell up with the water, right? Think about it. If you drink gallons of water, what's going to happen? You're going to make gallons of urine, right? You're going to pee all of that water out. You're not going to just swell up really big. The opposite is true as well. If you don't drink any fluid and you're dehydrated, you're going to stop producing very much urine, and your body's going to try and hold on to that fluid, right? It tries to maintain stability or stay balanced, despite the fact that things outside of us are changing and things inside of us are changing. Again, I mentioned when the body is unable to return to its normal state or unable to return to homeostasis, that's when illness or disease occurs. Think about blood pressure, right? Our blood pressure is supposed to stay relatively stable. Sometimes if you start exercising or you get really stressed out, your blood pressure might go up a little bit. Or when you're really relaxed, sleeping, your blood pressure might go down a little bit, but it should stay relatively stable. It should stay in a nice normal range. Now, if your body is unable to maintain that stability, it's unable to stay homeostatic, and your blood pressure goes up too high, well, that's when somebody is diagnosed with hypertension, right? High blood pressure, because they're no longer in a nice normal range. And then because they're not in homeostasis, there's all sorts of other problems that can start occurring in the body. There are multiple mechanisms of regulation that the body uses to try and stay homeostatic or to try and stay nice and normal balanced. We'll talk about autoregulation versus extrinsic regulation. Autoregulation is also called intrinsic regulation, means the same thing. So autoregulation is when there's an automatic response in a cell or a tissue or an organ to some sort of environmental change. So something changes in that cell or around that cell. The cell itself notices that there's a change and it directs a response to try and fix it. Okay. auto-regulation literally means self-regulation. This term auto means self. So the cell or the tissue or the organ is self-regulating. It doesn't require any external source or organ to fix the problem. It fixes the problem itself. Sorry, I just threw my pen, hang on. So it auto-regulates or self-regulates. You can also think it's intrinsic regulation because it does not require an external source. This is like an internal problem. It's internally solved. An example of this, when oxygen levels decrease in an area, the cells themselves release local vasodilators that bring more blood to the area. So let's think about that. You don't have to understand, you don't have to know that that's the response, but if I describe this to you, you should be able to say, okay, is this intrinsic auto-regulation or is this extrinsic? If you think about it, this is a blood vessel that's bringing blood to these cells. And this blood has oxygen that gets delivered. So these cells don't have enough oxygen. Okay, oxygen levels have gone down. That means it's no longer homeostasis, right? It's not balanced anymore. It doesn't have enough oxygen. So this cell notices, okay, I don't have enough oxygen, and it releases a chemical that comes over here and dilates this blood vessel. That means it makes the blood vessel bigger. Right, the vessel opens up, and now we have more blood come, more oxygen gets delivered, and the problem is fixed. That is auto-regulation. This cell had a problem, and it fixed the problem for itself. It did not rely on any other control mechanism. It didn't need the brain to tell the blood what to do. It didn't need a hormone to tell it what to do. It fixed the problem itself. Now, extrinsic regulation is when there's a response to a change in the environment that's controlled by an external source. Okay, so in this case, say the cell realized something was wrong, but the cell couldn't fix it, right? The cell didn't have the ability to control their response. Maybe the cell would send a signal up to the brain that something was wrong, and then the brain would control the response. That would be extrinsic regulation. Okay, think extrinsic. There's an external source, right? Something outside that has to come in and fix the problem for us. In most situations with extrinsic regulation, the external source is normally the nervous system, which is like the brain, right? The brain tells the body what to do in a lot of situations, or the endocrine system. The endocrine system includes glands and hormones. Okay, so very frequently, if we're relying on some other organ to fix something for the body, it's going to be either the brain or some sort of a gland or hormone. An example of extrinsic regulation, again, is body temperature. When body temperature increases, right, the nervous system, i.e. the brain, recognizes the change in temperature, and it sends instructions out to the body that bring the body back to a normal homeostatic temperature. So say I have temperature receptors here on my arm, and they sense, hey man, my temperature is way too hot. Those cells that are sensing the temperature can't cause my body to start sweating to cool off. They don't have that ability. All they can do is send a little alarm up to the brain. And then the brain says, okay, I'm too hot. I know we need to make sweat, and it sends the signal out to all of the sweat glands in the body to make sweat. Okay? In that situation, these cells right here could not fix the issue themselves. They had to rely on an external source, the brain, to fix it. So that's extrinsic regulation. Now, these regulatory mechanisms, right, that we rely on to bring the body back to homeostasis have three general parts: a receptor, a control center, and an effector. The receptor is the thing that notices the change, right? It notices the stimulus or change, and it sends that information to the control center. Okay, so we just said temperature sensors. Those little temperature sensors or temperature receptors are the things that notice something has changed and they send the signal off. The control center, which is typically the brain, frequently the brain, gets that information, processes it, and sends instructions out to the body to fix the problem. The body, the thing that it's sending instructions to, is referred to as the effector. So the effector is the thing that carries out the instructions. When we talked about body temperature, the effector would have been the sweat glands, right? The things that are producing sweat to try and cool the body back off again. Here we see a real life example of a very similar type of feedback loop. This is just your room temperature, right? And an air conditioner in your house. So for your house, homeostasis, right? Normal regulated body, normal regulated home is a normal room temperature. Okay, so my house right now is 74 degrees. So 74 degrees is my homeostasis. That's my norm. Now say that changes. For whatever reason, you know, the doors open and the house gets hot. So the room temperature changes. Okay? The first thing that's going to happen is my air conditioning system has to notice that it's too hot, right? It can't fix it until it notices that there's a problem. So there's a thermometer that's always measuring the temperature, and the thermometer notices that the temperature is now high. It's now above 74, right? That thermometer is the receptor, the thing that senses a change. Now the thermometer gives that information to the control center or the thermostat, and the thermostat says, okay, I see we're supposed to be at 74, but we're at 76. I must have to cool the room down. And that control center or thermostat sends the information to the actual air conditioner to turn on, blow cold air, and cool the room off back to normal. Okay, so in that case, the air conditioner that's actually blowing the cold air, that's the effector. Right? So the receptor notices the change. The control center figures out what to do about it and sends out the command, and the effector actually fixes the situation. We call this a feedback loop because it loops around. Right? We started at normal, and then something was weird, something changed, and we end up right back at normal. Right? And normal is homeostasis. Now, when we talk about homeostasis, we talk about different types of feedback mechanisms. There are two types of feedback mechanisms that affect homeostasis, either bringing us towards homeostasis, towards norm, or away from homeostasis. The two feedback mechanisms are negative feedback and positive feedback. We'll start with negative feedback. Negative feedback is the most common by far. Almost all responses in our body are negative feedback responses or negative feedback loops. In negative feedback, the response of the effector negates the stimulus, right? Negates is like cancels out. So something starts to change and the effector, right, says no and brings the body right back to homeostasis. Okay, so the effector cancels the change. It cancels the stimulus, bringing the body back into homeostasis. Now, it makes sense that most feedback mechanisms are negative feedback because this brings the body back into homeostasis. We want to be homeostatic, right? The body wants to be nice, normal, balanced. So we start to change and then the response cancels it out and goes right back down to normal. That's negative feedback. Examples, we keep talking about body temperature. Our body temperature maintenance is negative feedback, right? We cool the body off when it gets hot. So temperature goes up, we sweat to cool off and go back to normal. That's negative feedback. The opposite's also true, right? We warm the body up when it gets cold. If our body temperature goes down, we shiver to warm up, right? It starts to change and the body's response is, no, go back to normal. go back to homeostasis. That's negative feedback, right? Think about water. I said, if I chug all this water, I'm going to make more pee, right? I increase the amount of fluid in my body, so my body pees to decrease the amount of fluid back to normal. That's negative feedback. Now this looks just like the other feedback loop that we looked at when we looked at the air conditioner, right? Very similar, but this is what actually happens in the body. You see here, homeostasis is normal body temperature, right? So about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The stimulus here, or the change, the thing that goes wrong, is that our body temperature rises. The temperature goes up. First, remember, we're going to have receptors that sense this change. We have temperature sensors all throughout our skin, and then we also have some in the hypothalamus. That's a special part of the brain. So we have these temperature sensors or receptors all over the body that sense temperature. They're going to sense that the temperature is increased, and they send that information to the control center. The control center in this case is the thermoregulatory center in the brain. And the brain says, okay, I see that we're too hot. I know how to fix this problem. And it sends instructions out to try and cool the body down. Those instructions are going to the effectors. Right? Think like the things that are carrying out an effect. In this case, the sweat glands produce sweat. You guys all know that when you get really hot, you get sweaty, right? And that's because as the sweat evaporates off of you, it literally takes heat energy away from you, right? The heat energy goes into the water to make it evaporate. So that heat is leaving your body and you cool off. Another effector in this case are blood vessels. The blood vessels in the skin, the surface, dilate or get bigger to bring the blood to the surface. So you bring your blood to the surface, and then the sweat takes heat away from it to cool you down. That's why when you're really hot, you look flushed, right, or red. Especially like the lighter the skin, the more apparent it is. So the effectors produce sweat, bring blood to the surface, and that cools the body off, right? We lose heat from the body temperature drops, and then what do you know? We go right back to normal, back to homeostasis. Now, is this a positive feedback loop or a negative feedback loop? Hopefully you guys said negative feedback, because the body started to change, right? And then we said, no, go back to normal. So that's negative feedback. It brings us back to homeostasis, back to normal. Positive feedback is the opposite. In positive feedback, the effector does something to increase the change. Right? So this means the body starts to change, something weird, brings us away from homeostasis. And the effector says, okay, I can see where you're going with that. Let's change more. And then that makes it change even more. And then that makes it change even more. And it's this like loop that speeds up more and more and more, and it changes the body more and more and more. And it brings the body further away from homeostasis or away from normal. Now you can imagine this is very rare because the body doesn't typically want these crazy swings back and forth. We said the body wants to be balanced, right? Hence, you don't swell up really big and then shrink down really small and then get really hot and then get really cold. You don't. You maintain balance. So positive feedback loops are relatively rare. I want you guys to memorize these two specific examples: contractions during childbirth and blood clotting. These are very specific situations where for a short period of time, the body is brought further away from normal, further away from homeostasis. We'll talk about blood clotting in a second. So let's just talk about contractions during childbirth right now. So homeostasis, or normal for the uterus, is at rest, right? Thank God that normal is not a contracting uterus. If that was the case, women would always be walking around in terrible pain, right? Normal, balanced body means the uterus is at rest. However, when it's time for an infant to be born, the uterus starts contracting, right? And if you've ever had a baby or known anyone who's had a baby or seen it on TV, you know that those contractions don't start huge, right? It starts kind of small. You know, the person, oh God, I think I'm going into labor. And then the contraction gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That's positive feedback happening. That first little contraction causes a chemical to be released in the brain, and that chemical causes a bigger contraction. And then that causes even more chemical. That causes a bigger contraction. That causes even more chemical. And there's this loop that just keeps circling around and around and around, and it grows, and the contractions get bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually, the infant is expelled from the body, placenta leaves the body, and then the contractions stop. Right? They don't go on forever. But for that period of time where the contractions build, that's a positive feedback loop. Brings the body further away from normal. And it's happening to allow some specific process to occur. In this case, an infant to be born. Here we see blood clotting. Now, normal homeostasis for our blood is not for the blood to clot. The blood should not be thick and sticky and chunky. The blood should be very thin and liquidy, and it should flow smooth through our blood vessels. However, there are times where we need the blood to get thick, right, and to get gel-like. And that's when we have a break in a blood vessel and we start to bleed. In order to stop the bleeding, we need the blood to clot. You do not need to know all the specifics of what happens here. It's actually a really complex process. We learn it in A&P 2. But for right now, just think of the fact that normally the blood flows through this vessel really smooth. It's liquidy. But when there's a break or a tear in the blood vessel, the blood starts gushing out, right? We start bleeding, and we don't want that to happen. So we need the blood to thicken up in this area, right? So it stops leaking out. Now, when the vessel is first broken, there are chemicals that get released into the bloodstream. And those chemicals start these chain reactions that make the blood get really sticky. And then once the blood, the platelets start to get sticky, they release more chemicals. And that makes more platelets and get sticky. It makes the blood clot more. And then that releases more chemicals, and that makes it clot more, and that releases more chemicals, and that makes it clot more. So there's this little period of time where the blood gets stickier and stickier and stickier and stickier, and then what do you know, eventually we're able to form this solid mass that patches up the vessel wall, so we stop bleeding, we stop losing blood. Now, again, that process is not normal. We don't want the body to just start throwing blood clots everywhere. Like when blood clots get stuck in your head, that's a stroke. When they get stuck in the vessels of the heart, that's a heart attack. So we don't want the blood to clot unnecessarily. However, very specific situations require the blood to get thick and sticky. While that is happening, that is a positive feedback loop. As we introduce anatomy and physiology, we have to introduce something called anatomical terminology. Now, you're going to do most of your work with anatomical terminology in lab. As you guys go through your first couple chapters of lab, you'll see that I have multiple videos talking about anatomical terminology. What this is it's just a universal language that we use when we talk about the body. So this is why when you hear, a doctor or a researcher talk, it sounds like they're talking in a different language because they're using very specific technical terms. Well, you're going to learn a lot of that anatomical terminology throughout A&P 1 and 2. Okay, again, you'll work on a lot of it in lab this first chapter. When we use anatomical terminology, we're always assuming that the body is in a standard position called the anatomical position. Okay, so that's the body is straight, the legs are straight with the feet forward, the arms are straight at the sides with the palms forward, the face is facing forward like this. Okay, so if I had a gunshot wound, right here in the arm, I could say that the gunshot wound is 2 inches distal to the left shoulder. Okay, that means distal, like further down. Actually, I would say from the anterior left shoulder, from the front of the left shoulder. Now, that tells the surgeon, the ER physician, the EMT or paramedic where the wound is, right? Using that technical terminology. Now, we assume that position regardless of how I'm actually laying. If I was laying on the ground like this, I'm not going to describe it as being above the shoulder, even though my arm is up here. I'm still describing it as being below the shoulder. So no matter how the body is actually positioned, we assume or we describe things as if the body were in this anatomical position. Now, you don't have to be, or people are not always standing up straight like this. You know, you can have somebody laying down in the anatomical position. And in that case, when the patient is laying down, we describe them as being either supine or prone. So you'll hear those terms a lot. If you work in the hospital, I'm sure you've heard them a billion times. Supine is when someone's laying face up. So they're laying on their back and their face is up to you. Prone is the opposite. When somebody is prone, they're laying face down. The way I remember that is supine is like you're supposed to, right? Nobody wants to mash their face into the bed. They want to lay with their face free. So supine like you're supposed to. Prone, you're prone to hurt your nose, right? If you're laying prone, your face is getting smashed into the bed. You're prone to hurt your nose. That's how I remember. Now, when we talk about anatomical terminology in the lab, you guys will see that we talk about numerous different anatomical regions to describe broad areas of interest or disease or injury. There are different body regions, like the cephalic region is the head, and then individual body parts as well. We also in lab talk about the abdominopelvic quadrants and regions. Those are just areas that we can divide the abdomen up into. And then finally in lab, you guys will also learn the anatomical directions. These are just directional terms. So like instead of saying up and down or further and closer, we'll use technical terminology now for directional terms. One thing I do want to mention here is that when we say right and left, we're always referring to the patient's right and left, not your right and left. So if I'm looking at the patient right now, it's going to be opposite, right? So my right side is their left side. So don't forget that. That's really important. People have had the wrong leg cut off because of silliness like that. When we talk about anatomical terminology, we mentioned planes. Planes are important. A plane is just a three-dimensional axis. So an imaginary axis cutting through the body. And a section is a slice of the body that goes parallel to that plane. We use these to visualize inside the body. Right, so if somebody has a bunch of swelling here in the top right side of their stomach and it hurts really bad, and we think maybe something's wrong with the liver, we can get an MRI or a CT scan to actually look at the liver, to visualize it and see what's going on. So when we do that, we would order it according to a certain plane. If you look here, these are showing you three kind of bland, basic planes. A transverse plane cuts through the body horizontally. Right, this is this green one that you see, dividing the body into top and bottom. So I could order a scan according to this transverse plane, and it would slice the body into tiny little sections and let you view each one of those. And we could they would look like this. And we could put a bunch of them together to actually get a 3D image to see what the body looks like in that area. A sagittal plane is in blue here. This cuts through the body vertically, dividing it into right and left. So this plane right here is right in the very middle of the body. So we refer to that as mid-sagittal because it's in the very, very middle. Notice in this picture here, you don't see any of the legs at all, right? Because it's directly in the midline of the body. Now it could also be what we call parasagittal. And parasagittal is just anything that's not in the middle. So it could be cutting through the body here, 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 anywhere else that's not directly in the middle, that's parasagittal. Finally, a frontal plane also cuts through the body vertically. That's this one you see in purple. And it divides the body into front and left. Front and back. This just describes all of the different planes. Finally, the last major thing that you guys will see in lab when we talk about terminology is the body cavities. Now, when we look inside the body's not just like one big, huge sac. Inside, we see that there are muscular walls and fibrous walls that divide the body up into little sections or cavities. And those cavities are important because they protect the organs that are within them. And they give those organs room to grow and change and shape as they're functioning. For example, like when you fill your stomach up with a big meal, it stretches out. It needs room for that. The heart, as your heart beats, it moves quite a bit. It needs room for that. So these organs have their own cavities that give them space that they need to change in size and shape. This right here is a nice kind of very type A way to break up the main body cavity in the front, which is the ventral body cavity. We talk all about the body cavities in one of the lab videos, so I'm not going to talk through this at all. I just wanted to include this for you guys because it's a really specific, clear-cut way to break the body cavities up. So after you work through the labs, you'll know exactly what I mean. You can come back and look at this and you'll see it's like a nice, smooth, clear-cut type A chart, which I'm super type A, so I love this chart. But anyhow, that sums it up. The rest of this kind of introductory material is found in the lab videos. They're posted on YouTube, and then you guys also have them in your Top Hat platform. So you'll work through those hopefully in the next day or two. All right, thanks so much. Tomorrow we'll go ahead and get started on our chemistry chapter. So this is it for chapter 1.